I understand that many of us are tired of hearing Destiny's story criticized, but I think we ought to keep doing it until the developers are tired of hearing it too. Destiny is Bungie's first new franchise in a long time, and for that I'm willing to cut them some slack, yet I can't see much slack being cut for the game's first expansion, The Dark Below, which is on the horizon. If there aren't discernible improvements, I'm not going to curse Bungie to eternal damnation or anything. I'm just going to fairly calmly stop playing, and probably stop buying too. That being said, we need to be thoughtful about what we criticize, lest Bungie spend time fixing the wrong problems. Criticism is hard. The reason? Every fault and every failing has the potential to be a strength in another context. Reprimanding Destiny for its lack of storytelling isn't very helpful, when you can just as quickly praise Dark Souls for its own lack of storytelling. Thus, it's important to conjecture why Destiny's faults are faults, and that's what I'll attempt to do in this video series. But first, let's get another question out of the way. Yes? Of course, there are such things as video games completely devoid of story. Tetris, for instance. But Tetris is fairly unique. Its premise is simple enough that it needs no contextual information to express itself. Even something only a little more complicated, such as Pac-Man, needs a bit of context to communicate. In Pac-Man, the stage hazards are depicted as ghosts. Players can immediately identify the ghosts as something to be avoided because the players are likely familiar with the concept of ghosts. Without sufficient context, a first-person shooter is essentially the repeated act of catching a moving point that is not under your control, with another moving point that is. In fact, it's kind of like this. But the visuals, the sound, the writing all create a sense that you're doing something more. Another aspect of Tetris that's worth consideration is the scoring system. In Tetris, the score is nothing but the numerical representation of a player's potency, or maybe it's more accurate to call it a measurement of how well a play session is going. However, a number in a role-playing game is meant to represent a fictional character's potency. In Dungeons & Dragons, a character with 18 strength is very strong, and a character with 3 strength is very not strong. From a gameplay perspective, the number is the important part. Without it, we don't really have a game. But without knowing what that number represents, without context, I don't think the game we have would be all that fun. This is where the argument that gameplay is king falls apart. It's true that in some games, context is a means to the gameplay, but in other games, such as Dungeons & Dragons and all its descendants, of which Destiny is one, it's the context that people want, and it's the gameplay that serves as a means to the context. Destiny's tagline isn't "catch a moving point that is not under your control with another moving point that is." Its tagline is "become legend." With that in mind, which sort of game do you think Destiny wants to be? It would be remiss of me not to acknowledge that there is a difference between story and context. However, a good story is invaluable when it comes to establishing context, and a bad story can go a long way towards damaging context credibility. After all, why should we care about the strength of a fictional character when all the other characters surrounding her are uninteresting, and the narrative to which she's bound is inconsistent? Bungie wants us to want to become legend, but from what we've seen of Destiny's universe, it's difficult to understand why we should care. Video games have something the other mediums do not. Play. For instance, Minecraft hinges upon emergent gameplay, which means the sandbox is diverse enough that you can make your own stories. When I think of Minecraft, I remember getting separated from my paramour, who was also my co-op partner, and then getting lost. I spent an obscenely long time trying to find my way back to her, only to become more and more lost. Finally, I dug deep into a mountain and procured the materials for a compass, only to be blown up by a creeper before I could put that compass to use. Conversely, when I think of The Last of Us, I remember Joel and Ellie's desperate and danger-fraught quest for survival and for purpose. My play never contributed to the story. It only strengthened my engagement with the story. When I think of Dark Souls, I remember bits of both. I regard Dark Souls' story as something of a continued exchange between gamer to gamer, and I am referring to the story, not the lore. The game's setting, Lordran, is sometimes described as an unfriendly one, but I tend to think of it as indifferent. We know almost nothing about Lordran except what we manage to piece together ourselves as we explore it, and the more we learn, the more we notice the trend of dead heroes and dead civilizations, of a bygone place. We eventually realize that our goal in Dark Souls is to prolong the Age of Fire, which is the era in which we find ourselves. And yet by the time we learn this, we've already begun to suspect that we're saving a land that's already dead. As we perform increasingly impressive deeds, the land upon which we do so remains stoically unimpressed. We begin to wonder if saving the land, which in video games is usually a reliable course of action, is really worth doing, and why we set out to do it in the first place. In its opening moments, the quest we're given is utterly mysterious. All we're told by the person who entrusts us with our mission is that by ringing the bell of awakening, we'll know our fate. The game's entire premise is founded on a mystery that keeps expanding. Just like that, Dark Souls has established the sort of story it hopes to tell. Destiny begins similarly to Dark Souls. Both have an exposition dump at the beginning, and I happen to think that's a misstep in both games, but Destiny's is that little bit worse because it's narrated by a character we can meet. This makes it very conspicuous when we do encounter the character and find ourselves unable to interrogate him on the knowledge he's already proven himself to have. This character, the speaker, gives us our mission. He tells us to push back the darkness. He doesn't tell us to learn about the darkness. He doesn't tell us to discover what the darkness really is. Nothing about what he says implies that this is an unknown, that Destiny's universe is covered in the same blanket of mystery as is Lordran.
The children are frightened anyway.
If some of the characters, or at least the player character, only mirrored our confusion, it would make the whole thing just that much easier to swallow.
What?
The children of...
It seems Bungie's writing team is just as incapable of negotiating our expectations as it is conveying information about its setting. In Dark Souls, we can see and we are told that the asylum's other inhabitants have lost their minds, and we can safely assume that the giant demon who attacks us as we approach the asylum's exit is a sort of security guard. In Destiny, our first enemies are called Fallen, and they are obviously sentient, and it's implied by our companion, Ghost, that they are pursuing us because we are in their territory. So, we're given to understand that the Fallen are territorial creatures, but then later they're said to be agents of the darkness. That seems like a pretty good reason to pursue us as well. So why then didn't Ghost tell us that the Fallen were affiliated with the Traveler's ancient enemy? But then later again, the Fallen are shown to be fighting against members of the Hive, another affiliate of the darkness. Where Dark Souls is vague in all the right places, Destiny is not. Both games have characters who communicate to us very little. The characters we meet in Dark Souls are either distrustful, deceitful, mad, or as ignorant as we are.
Do you watch your step?
Thus their failure to fill us in on what's going on is completely conceivable. In Destiny, we are accompanied by a companion for the entire duration of the game, and while he can sometimes be quite inexpressive,
I'm a ghost, actually.
He appears neither distrustful, deceitful, mad, nor ignorant. So why does he have so little to tell us about Destiny's universe, or even about the motives behind and the consequences of our own actions?
You're gonna see a lot of things you won't understand.
We also have other characters with whom to interact. There's the Speaker, the Stranger, the Queen, and the Queen's brother. Of those, only the Queen and her brother seem to have sufficient reason to withhold information from the player character. Perhaps you could argue that the Stranger may have reasons for keeping us in the dark too, but she appears fairly eager to cooperate. Regardless, it doesn't account for the game's sheer lack of information. Much of Dark Souls' background story is communicated through the descriptions affixed to in-game items found in specific places around Lordran. This model is incompatible with Destiny's random loot system. The grimoire works slightly better because the methods for acquiring grimoire cards are fixed, and thus players can reliably hunt for individual cards. Of course, as has been bemoaned again and again, the grimoire can only be accessed through Bungie's website, which means there's a barrier between the player playing the game and the information that might be necessary to enjoy it. But even if we could access the grimoire in-game, Destiny has simply not been designed to synergize very well with this sort of storytelling. Miyazaki, the director of Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, famously said that he was inspired by the experience of reading fantasy novels in English without having a firm grasp of the language. He had to make use of his imagination to fill in what he couldn't understand. Whereas Dark Souls feels like a novel with words or even pages taken out here and there, Destiny feels like notes scrawled on a napkin, hinting at a story for which the author has no clear vision yet. The development team may know the details of Destiny's narrative now, but they didn't while they were working on the game. But maybe Bungie never intended to replicate the feeling of uncovering Dark Souls' deftly buried story. Maybe Bungie just wanted to sustain some of its mysteries over multiple installments. I mean, the developers would have no story left but the latter half of their proposed 10-year plan if they gave it all away in the first game, right? Right? But what about Mass Effect? Destiny's story is often compared with that of Mass Effect because both games share the same genre. That's almost like comparing this fruit with this lamp because they share the same color. But there is another similarity between these two games that may prove more relevant. The first Mass Effect came with a promise of 2 more games to follow. There's nothing novel about sequels in the video game industry, but at the time of Mass Effect's release, it was the only game I knew of that had been planned as the first part of a trilogy. The first game released in November 2007, and the final DLC for Mass Effect 3 released in March 2013. That's about a 5.5-year period. In fact, you might say that BioWare had a 5-year plan. So, if Destiny's story has mostly been reserved for other milestones in Bungie's 10-year plan, then the first Destiny should have exactly half as much story as the first Mass Effect, since Mass Effect only needed to reserve enough story to fill a 5-year plan. Unfortunately, Destiny does not have half as much story as Mass Effect. I actually did the maths, and it turns out that Mass Effect has 695,800% more story than Destiny. The 10-year plan does not account for Destiny's bad story. It does not account for sparse and otherwise conflicting information, it does not account for a sheer lack of characters, compelling or otherwise, it does not account for awkward dialogue, and it does not account for an utter inattention to detail. Bad writing accounts for those things.
Enemy captured Zone B. Ha ha! More efforts like that, and we might just win this.
This is going to sound fairly sanctimonious, not to mention condescending, but it's something I have to keep in mind myself as well. This isn't the sort of thing that's worth getting angry over. We are just being critical here, after all. We are weighing the success of Destiny's story, and it happens to weigh very little. It's disappointing, sure, but the people at Bungie haven't directly slandered any of us or anything, so I don't think it makes much sense to slander any of them in turn. And besides, if the developers are truly proud of the work they do, then a negative critique should prove far more impactful than hurled curse words, threats, and insults. Thank you very much for watching, and a special thank you to my patient subscribers. In the past few weeks I've had to submit a scholarship application and start a new job. I haven't had much time to work on videos. I'm not sure if I'll get the other videos in this series out before the Dark Below's release, but I'll do my best.